If you're paying attention, you know that the Lumix S1R Mark II has finally been revealed with basically all the specs that were leaked ahead of time. So if you've been following along here or over at L Rumors or wherever you get your information, you probably know everything that was revealed. But I do want to talk about the live stream this morning because I was listening, paying attention, and just give you some of my main takeaways, break it down for the most important stuff, at least as it applies to me. But before we get started, like this video, hit the subscribe button, and consider joining the channel. Channel members get exclusive access to Filmmaker Alchemy, behind-the-scenes lessons and insights on the business of video production. Learn how to turn your content into gold. So like I said, I want to talk about the main takeaways from this event so you can maybe skip the whole live event if you want, but I do recommend you go watch it. At the end, Sean does do a Q&A session, responds to some questions that came up in the live chat. But for me, my main takeaway, one of the biggest ones, was first and foremost, this idea of this being a photo camera or a video camera. And Panasonic, or Lumix themselves, talked about this being a camera for creators. They use that word a lot, creators. And the way I take that is that we're finally reaching a point in the industry, in the marketplace, where we can actually talk about these things being true hybrids. Now, we'll get to if the S1R Mark II is actually a true hybrid, because I do have some questions, some concerns, some things I need to test for myself, maybe some worries, but we will talk about the highlights as well, because I do think this is an incredibly powerful camera. The S1R Mark II is definitely a step up from the S1R, and it really helps Lumix put their S1 lineup into a modern perspective. These S1 cameras are getting quite dated at this point in time, and we got some great new features coming on the S1R Mark II, like 4K 60 uncropped. If you've known any of the full-frame Lumix cameras, the 60 mode has always been cropped, shooting APS-C or Super 35. And if you're buying a full-frame camera, do you want to deal with a crop mode? It can be an advantage in certain situations when you want to shoot cropped. But if you have to shoot cropped just because you want to shoot 60 frames a second, I'm glad we're finally past that time point where we have to shoot cropped just because we want to shoot 60. So the S1R Mark II can shoot 4K 60 uncropped. And to me, that does sound like a very heavy video feature, as well as something like shooting open gate and all the other great video modes that are on the S1R Mark II. It really is a hybrid camera, and their marketing is such. So anyone who shows up in the comments, because I'm going to get to some criticisms, I'm going to get to some complaints, I'm going to get to some worries, but anyone who calls out, well, this is a photo camera, go buy a video camera. Yes, that's exactly how they sound. That's the voice they make when they comment that. It's very frustrating to have to argue this over and over and over again. We've had excellent hybrids for the last 10 years, arguably all the way back to the GH5 being probably the first truly hybrid camera that I can think of where it shot great photo and great video. And look how far we've come. We're so much beyond the GH5. That's I think 10 years ago now, quite a while ago. And we're finally getting to a point where these companies are saying this is for creators. It's not for photographers. It's not for videographers. It's for creators, the people who want to do both. And I think that's so smart and so wise, and how we should be talking about it. It's why I changed this channel's name to Tographer, because it's not about photography. It's not about cinematography. It's about all of it, how they combine that hybrid approach in a body that is a camera body that is comfortable to hold. It's ergonomic. It has all the features and buttons right where you want them to be. I don't necessarily want a big box camera that's heavy and bulky with batteries. We've talked about that enough. Let's go back to the S1R Mark II, because I did take some notes while I was listening to this stream. Sean mentioned at the end of the stream that this doesn't have an optical low-pass filter, and that might be a little bit concerning, but the way that Sean described it was that the high resolution reduces the need for an optical low-pass filter. So I really want to see more testing here to see if that's actually true. Obviously, one of the problems with the S5 Mark II that people have mentioned is the issues with moire aliasing on really fine details. That optical low-pass filter found in something like the S1H, the original S1H, helps kind of smooth all that fine texture detail out, so you're not getting those, artificial colors and patterns in the moire, which we all hate, we all want to avoid, but it can hit you from time to time on the S5 Mark II. They're saying that the S1R Mark II doesn't need the optical low pass filter, but I do want to see if that's actually true, because I'm a little skeptical, but maybe Sean is right that the higher resolution compensates for those details. We've also got the BLK22 batteries in the S1R Mark II. This was another point of contention, consideration. The S1 cameras, the original lineup, had different batteries, a little bit bigger, a little bit more quote unquote professional, but these BLK22s I do think are quite nice. They might not have enough juice for you and whatever you're doing, but I just like the idea of a standardized battery set across all the camera bodies. I don't like the idea of buying a new camera body, requiring new batteries and new accessories and all these new things. I like that they're sticking with things like CF Express Type B and the SD card slot. Use what we have. If I've got plenty of BLK22s, I'll probably get more, and it's just nice to have one battery for all the cameras. So I do think that's smart and a great choice by Lumix. We've also got this question of readout speeds that we're going to get to in a little bit, but as of the stream, as of the Q&A, Sean didn't really quite give a good mention of what the readout of this sensor is. And I think that's a little red flag. It should be an issue. I mentioned that this is something to keep an eye out for. What's the readout speed? Are we going to have rolling shutter problems? Are we going to have jello? Are we going to have skew? Are we going to have these slow readout sensor problems? And I think signs point to it's maybe likely so, because they didn't address it on the stream. It wasn't part of the presentation. It wasn't really mentioned in the Q&A. So the things that are said are important. The features they're highlighting are important, but it's also important to pay attention to what's unsaid, what is unspoken, what aren't they talking about, because that's where you can look for those red flags and know, maybe this isn't the camera for you, depending on your needs. Now, if you don't need a super fast sensor and the rolling shutter, the skew, the jello doesn't matter to you, then great, fine. It doesn't have to be a consideration. But if that is of concern, something you definitely want to pay attention to, and I would go recommend, this is where we can get into some of the worries, the criticisms, go check out Gerald Undone. Obviously, everyone knows him, loves him. He's got great videos on the S1R Mark II, because they gave him one, and he breaks down very critically, I would say, the S1R Mark II and what the rolling shutter actually is. It's a very slow sensor. So Panasonic isn't going to put that in their presentation. They're not going to put that out at the forefront. You have to go look to other YouTubers, but I do appreciate that with people like Gerald who get their hands on this camera and they're not just all goo goo gaga falling in love with Panasonic. Oh, it's the greatest camera ever. No, call them out and be honest, tell the truth, because the worst feeling ever is buying a product that you think can do A, B, and C, and it turns out it actually can, or it comes with these restrictions or limitations. The other one being overheating. This is one that I think we need to pay more attention to and really understand all the limitations of this camera, the S1R Mark II, because again, in the live stream, in the Q&A session, they didn't really talk about it other than, yeah, it's ventilated, just like the S5 Mark II, and they left it at that. They didn't go into thermal management, and we've built-in cooling, and this is a great camera, won't overheat. They didn't make any of those promises. It's just kind of, yeah, it has ventilation, just like the S5 Mark II, and left it at that. So again, what's unsaid is probably more important than what is said in certain cases. And if you go over to Gerald's video, in the Canadian winter, he had overheating issues in certain modes. Now, he goes through all the hoops you can jump through to reduce those restrictions, but it is unfortunate to see a camera of this caliber marketed as for creators, as a hybrid camera, not really taking it that extra step further to really make sure that when you're shooting 8K, when you're shooting open gate, then we have a fast enough sensor to avoid the jello and that it can stay running continuously, or at least a relatively long continuous amount. 4 hours plus is the room where you feel safe. You never want that camera where around 30 minutes or around an hour, you're feeling a little shaky, like you're right at the precipice of where it's going to start overheating and giving you problems, to the point where you've got to take the battery out, or you can take the memory cards out and record externally and do all these things that no one wants to have to do just to keep the camera running at a reasonable temperature. So I do think it's a little unfortunate that we have another one of these cameras where, yes, it's for creators, yes, it's a hybrid camera, but it comes with some of these restrictions and issues. That's where I'm probably looking forward to something in the future that has more of that built in, the considerations around thermal management, because I personally don't want to have to worry about it. I don't want it to be in the back of my mind on a shoot thinking, oh gosh, am I going to lose features? Am I going to lose functionality just because it's a warm day? And again, Gerald is up in Canada in the winter. It's pretty cold up there. I'm in the Southwest. It gets pretty warm here in the summer. So I definitely, it's one of the important things for me, but maybe not so much for you. You can, do all the workarounds that Gerald mentions, and you can figure it out for yourself, I suppose. Now, the S1R Mark II is a dual ISO camera, but it wasn't until the Q&A session with Sean that we really dug into what that means. And there's This is a head scratcher for sure, and it's something that you're really gonna have to test for yourself. But depending on the picture profile, depending on if you're shooting the standard profiles, the Cine-like profiles, the Vlog profiles, those base ISOs change between all of them. So if you think, oh, I'm just gonna always shoot ISO 200, well, yes and no. Depending on the mode you're in, it's going to change. And it even changes whether you're using the dynamic range extended function versus the dynamic range extension being off. That'll also change those base ISO values for the dual ISO nature. So I wrote down the one that was most relevant to me, and it was for Vlog. Now, I hope I'm getting this right, because we're playing a game of telephone at this point. I'm just repeating what Sean said, but it was this small moment in the Q&A that really stood out to me. I was like, oh, that's important, but it's buried in the rest of the live stream. So for dual ISO, the base ISOs for Vlog are 200 and 1000 when dynamic range extension is off. And then the base ISOs for dynamic range extension being on are 400 and 2000. So if dynamic range is up, the extension is off, 200 and 1000, and then it basically, each of those double if the dynamic range extension is on, to up to 400 and 2000. And so this is where it's kind of one of those interesting things, because I've talked a lot about how these ISO values keep getting higher and higher and higher. And I'm constantly dealing with ND filters because the base ISOs are so high, of like 500 or 640 or 800 in some cases on some of these cameras. And now we almost have the opposite, where these base ISOs are lower, which I actually quite like. I like this about the S1R Mark II sensor, that I can shoot with a lower base ISO. Now, ISO gets a little confusing and a little complicated depending on what you need and when you need it. If you're trying to protect the highlights, you actually want to shoot with a higher ISO. And if you're trying to retain detail in the shadows, you want to shoot with a lower ISO, which is kind of counterintuitive. And there's plenty of videos out there, actually not plenty, but there are a few other creators who go into detail on this. And it is an important thing to understand. A lot of times we think about ISO just for exposure, but it also affects your dynamic range in certain situations, depending on what you're trying to protect. If you're trying to protect the highlights or the shadows. And you have to do kind of your own testing, see what's going to work for you. But I just like, on paper, fundamentally, the S1R Mark II favoring those lower ISO values. I find that very helpful for the type of work that I do, because I'm not always looking for this camera that can shoot in the dark, that has night vision. Maybe Lumix will release that. Maybe that'll be more of like what the S1RII is for, the Mark II version, or maybe they'll release some other variant like they did with the GH5S, where it was this kind of super sensitive, great in low light, you know, that night vision, you know, those kind of shots you see on social media where they're like, oh, I shot this in the dark and look, it looks like daylight. That's cool. That's neat. That's a fun, I think of kind of like as a gimmick, because most of the time lighting is available. It's cheap. It's affordable enough. We're shooting in daytime. We're shooting it in indoor, you know, where things are well lit enough. Now, if you're a nighttime videographer, photographer, whatever, fine, separate argument. But I just like the S1R Mark II having lower base ISOs, because I find that personally easier to work with, considering how fast some of our modern lenses are. If you're shooting at like a 1.4 on a full frame camera and you're following the 180-degree shutter angle rule, if you're working with a base ISO of 800, you're gonna need ND filters. Like, it's just this extra feature, this extra stuff you have to bring with you, you have to worry about. And until they start putting ND filters in the camera, which I think they should, but the S1R Mark II doesn't have that, it's nice to see a lower base ISO. Like I said, 200 being kind of the lowest Vlog base ISO, which is actually nice and significantly lower than what is on the S5 Mark II. I believe base ISO is 640 in Vlog on the S5 Mark II. It might be 500. I'm forgetting, I get it confused with the GH7, which I think that base ISO is 500 in Vlog. Regardless, either way, the S1R Mark II has lower base ISOs, which may or may not be helpful depending on who you are. Again, we have the same ventilation as the S5 Mark II, whatever that means. Certainly something I would want to test myself and see, okay, in the modes that I like to shoot, am I going to be put against these kind of limitations of overheating and thermal management? And the other downside I will have to say about the S1R Mark II is that we're not getting 8K open gate from day one. This is coming soon in a firmware update at some point. And I do trust Lumix. They've always delivered on these firmware updates. They've got great history of support for all their cameras. Even the S5 Mark II is still being updated, as they've talked about with their new Lumix Flow app. the S5 Mark II is going to get support for that, as well as the GH7. So it's nice to see that they continually provide these firmware updates, but I think it would have been a real nice, a nice icing on the cake to say from day one, you can shoot 8K open gate. And in Gerald's video, he demonstrates this. He says that he was shooting 8K open gate and getting more of that rolling shutter jello distortion, but I wonder if they, with these pre-production units that they sent out to reviewers, that they unlocked the 8K open gate, but it's not there on day one. It's a little confusing that he would have access to that, but if you go buy the camera, you won't have that, and you'll need to wait for a future firmware update. I don't know the ins and outs of how Gerald actually did his testing, but it is something that he mentioned in his video, and it is something I would recommend you go check out because it's a pretty eye-opening spotlight on where we're at with these Lumix cameras. The S1R Mark II on paper has all the specs you could ever want, but it's those in-between details. What's the readout speed of the sensor? What's the overheating like? What are those limitations that are the gotchas that are gonna go, oops, actually, no, that's not as great as it sounded. And there's plenty of cameras on the market, similar price points, similar specs. It's a very competitive landscape. And I'll probably make a video about that too, just kind of pointing out that the S1R Mark II isn't on an island all by itself. It's not the only camera that can do some of these things. Yes, there are the unique Lumix features that that I love, things like hybrid zoom, things like open gate, things like shutter angle, but it's not as cut and dry as it once was, where the Lumix cameras were the only ones doing 4K video in these really affordable consumer, prosumer level bodies, right? Back in the GH5 days, and even before that in the GH4, these were groundbreaking, things that were unheard of. Now, Lumix with the S1R Mark II, I think is playing catch up in a lot of ways. And these features, while they are nice, don't get me wrong, I love everything they're offering with the S1R Mark II. They're not quite as groundbreaking or trailblazing as they once were compared to other cameras on the market. And that's a harsh reality. That is a truth. Go check out Gerald's video. He says it better than I do, because who am I? I don't have this camera with me. I don't have it to show you or do my hands on. All I can give you is my opinion and perspective from someone who's been in the industry for a long time, from someone who's been shooting with Lumix for, gosh, over a decade now. The GH1 was my first camera that I ever bought myself. So from the GH1 days, so all the way back then, I've been a huge fan of Lumix, and I'm glad to see them continuing to push their S1 lineup with the S1R Mark II. I love my S5 Mark II. These are great, incredible, powerful cameras, but they're not alone. There's competition from Canon and Nikon and Sony and Fuji and Blackmagic, etc. Everyone's making incredible cameras these days. And these hybrids are exceptionally powerful to the point where they're almost outclassing and outpacing the cinema box camera equivalent in terms of dollars to dollars, apples to apples, dollars to donuts, whatever the phrase is, however you want to say it. It's very competitive these days. And, the market also seems to be shrinking as more and more people are comfortable shooting on their smartphones. The user base for these cameras, I don't know if it'll go up, down, or sideways into the future. I'm glad that there's plenty of us out there who are still shooting with these professional tools, right? These aren't just toys. They're not just a smartphone in your pocket you take out to snap a photo. These are professional tools, and I want them to perform as such. We need those powerful features, things like 8K. If you're going to offer it to its fullest. Don't restrict it with overheating and issues in that regard. Give us the absolute most when we're spending our hard-earned dollars on things that are, I can't say all this is expensive, because relatively so, historically so, it's not. These are actually very attainable, very approachable for professional work. But still, there's things like the S5 Mark II that they offer so much value. And yes, you deal with some problems like 4K 60 being cropped or the moire and the aliasing. There are slight gotchas with the S5 Mark II, but overall, for the price point, it's incredibly valuable. And I want to see that same value reflected in something like the S1R Mark II and not have to worry so much about the sensor readout speed and if I'm going to have to suffer with rolling shutter artifacts, or if there is any kind of overheating issues or any other goofy little problems that creep in from time to time. So I'm excited to see what this means for the future in something like an S1H, because if the S1R Mark II is the camera for creators, it is the hybrid. If they go all out with an S1H Mark II, that's the video version, like heavy video. This is the cinema version of this camera. Holy cow. Like, what could that mean? If it was maybe higher sensitivity for low light, maybe it is faster readout, maybe it is something like built-in NDs. Finally, something like that. Holy cow. Or people are speculating it's a follow-up to the EVA1, the EVA 1, the EVA 2, the EVA 2. If they go that route, who knows? I certainly don't know. I don't have any insider information. All I have is my opinion, my perspective, and my speculation from the outside. I'm going to check my notes to see if there's any final thoughts that I noted for myself. The readout speeds are still kind of like wishy-washy, but Gerald did some testing. And oh, that was the final thing from Gerald's video that you should go check out. The dynamic range extension. Basically, it'll give you a little bit more dynamic range, but it comes at the cost of a slower readout speed on the sensor. So depending on who you are and depending on what your needs are, if you don't need that, I think he measures it to a half stop extra in the highlights. If you don't need that little bit extra headroom in the highlights, you're better off leaving that dynamic range extension off, because it means the sensor reads out a little bit faster. You have less skew, less jello, and you could use that lower base ISO for cleaner shadows at ISO 200. So there's always trade-offs. There's always kind of knowing the right tool for the job and the right setting for the job, whatever your needs are in the particular moment, but all things that you need to pay attention to. And I really do appreciate Gerald's reviews because I love that he breaks down those technicals. I don't care if you're out in the desert shooting dirt bikes, or you're doing some cool skiing and surfing and snowboarding, or whatever you're doing, beautiful models and fashion photography. Great. I love it. But that's your job. That's the visuals you shot that day. I'm not going to be out there doing that because you already did it, right? So I like the reviews. I like the people who just break down, here's the technicals. Here's how this thing works. You use it for whatever creative job or application you want. And I want to try and do the same thing. Of course, there's always a little bit of value is showing the work, the stuff that was made with it, because that's kind of the end purpose. But it's far more valuable, I think, to have the technical breakdown and the understanding of the true benefits and the restrictions or those limitations as it relates to the tool, compared to, hey, here's some pretty pictures that I shot one day. Yes, if you go out to a picturesque landscape, it's going to look good. If you film or shoot someone who's aesthetically pleasing, your photos are going to look nice. There's some consideration around lighting, etc., styling, wardrobe, posing, etc. All that matters. But also, no two jobs are the same. You're never going to be doing exactly what you're seeing someone else do. So just knowing how the tool operates actually lets you know if it's the right tool for your job as opposed to someone else's. So shout out to Gerald. I think he always just delivers exceptional videos that aren't full of all the, everyone has their own bias. I'm not going to say he's free of any bias, but I do appreciate that he's willing to call out, Lumix for some of the limitations of this camera as he sees it from his perspective. I think the best review, the best experience is the one you do yourself, getting your hands on it. I would always recommend rent, try before you buy, make sure that whatever it is you're investing in actually works the way you want it to. Yes, comb through the 10 reviews from different people and get their perspective. Get my perspective, get more perspective. It's all helpful. It's all extra flavor. But until you do it yourself, and this is something I have to say myself, right? I'm kind of speaking from the sidelines, from the bench. I don't have an S1R Mark II in hand to actually tell you my experience from it. All I can give you is my gut reaction to the live stream this morning and some of the limited information that's out there so far. Best experience, do it for yourself, because then you know how it feels, which really is a whole nother video. And that's probably the most important part. Just how does it feel to use this thing? And that's something only you can tell yourself. And I'll have to tell myself one day once I actually get my hands on the S1R Mark II. But until then, stay tuned.